Welcome to Washington Today for Tuesday, December 14th, 2021. I'm Nkoyo Iyamba. The U.S. is on the verge of yet another pandemic milestone, 800,000 deaths. In the wake of this news, Pfizer updated results on its experimental pill to treat COVID-19. The company shows the pill cuts the risk of hospitalization or death by 89%. That's if given to high-risk adults within a few days of their first symptoms. Pfizer hopes to offer the pill under the name Paxlovid for people to take at home before they need to be hospitalized. We'll have more with Pfizer CEO Dr. Albert Bourla later in the program. The Senate voted 50-49 to lift the nation's debt limit by $2.5 trillion. That's under a deal struck between party leaders. The vote comes just one day before a deadline set by Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. Secretary Yellen warned last month that she was running out of maneuvering room to avoid the nation's first ever default. Again, the bill cleared the Senate on a party line vote of 50-49. We'll hear more on the latest from the Senate with TheHill.com's Alex Bolton. The House began debate on recommending criminal contempt charges against former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows. That's after Mr. Meadows said he would no longer cooperate with the January 6 committee investigating the Capitol insurrection. Josh Gerstein of Politico will discuss next steps and what it all means for President Trump's former chief of staff. We begin now in the Senate, where members voted 50-49 to raise the nation's current debt load of $28.9 trillion. Earlier today, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer addressed the debt limit deal and Build Back Better legislation.
We just had a really spirited discussion in our caucus, a discussion that will continue. Senator Warnock gave a very powerful speech in terms of voting rights, and our discussions are continuing. We're going to have another very busy week in the Senate. As you know, we're in the middle of it already. On the legislative front, the Senate voted to invoke cloture on NDAA this morning. That's bicameral, bipartisan. We're working in good faith to get the defense bill done quickly. The Senate will also address the debt limit today using the fast-track process and avoid a first-ever default. As I've said, no brinksmanship, no default on the debt, no risk of another recession. This is a very good thing, and I am glad that we had cooperation between Democrats and Republicans. The two parties came together to pass legislation setting up this fast-track process for addressing the debt limit. The legislation will raise the debt limit to a level commensurate with funding necessary to get into 2023. And we'll vote on final passage later today, and hopefully the House will get it. We're trying to get it to them as quickly as possible. This is about paying debt accumulated by both parties, Democrats and Republicans. So I'm pleased both parties came together to facilitate a process that has made addressing the debt possible. Once again, I thank the Republican leader and my Republican colleagues who voted to address this issue and worked, and the Republican leader worked with me to come up with something that would deal with this problem effectively. That means we'll cross another major item off our December to-do list. Also this week, we continue working through the process to advance President Biden's Build Back Better Act here in the Senate along the timeline that I've laid out. This week, the bipartisan bird path meetings with the parliamentarian will continue. I want to thank my colleagues, their staff, the parliamentarian, and her team for working through this important and difficult process. The President will also continue his conversations with our caucus as we work out the final details to move Build Back Better forward. So I thank my colleagues, I thank the President for their hard work and their commitment to get this done.
Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer on the Senate floor earlier. Now again, the Senate voted 50-49 to raise the debt limit. Senate Minority Whip John Thune of South Dakota also spoke about the economy, the Build Back Better legislation, and inflation.
Let me just, if I might, talk for a moment about what's happening here with respect to the Democrats' massive, reckless tax and spending spree. We got some information just in the last few days into last week that shed some light on kind of where we are in terms of the economy. And the economic news with respect to inflation showed that inflation is at its highest level in 39 years. Almost 40 years since inflation has been where it is today. And somebody pointed out that back in 1982, E.T. was in the theater the last time inflation was this high. But it's not a transitory thing. The Federal Reserve has now removed that description from their lexicon in talking about inflation. This is something that is impacting people's budgets on a daily basis, whether it's food, whether it's gasoline, whether it's rent, utilities, everything is being impacted right now by this run-up in inflation. And even if you were getting a pay raise, a pay increase, in many cases it's not keeping up with the cost of inflation. So many people in this country are getting what is a de facto, an actual pay cut as a result of this rapid increase in run-up in prices. So it seems like a really bad time to be talking about spending a whole lot of new money in the economy that would further exacerbate this inflationary problem, this crisis that we're currently experiencing. And then coupled with that piece of news on inflation was also the report from the Congressional Budget Office that pointed out that if the programs the Democrats are proposing here in their reckless tax and spending spree were continued, and every expectation is they would be, that the actual cost of their proposal isn't $1.7 trillion, it's actually $4.9 trillion, almost $5 trillion expansion and growth in government in the Democrats' reckless tax and spending spree. And what it further pointed out was that the revenue that they expect to raise from the tax increases that they already have in the bill will come dramatically short of covering that. In fact, it would leave a $3 trillion difference, $3 trillion, which would be added to the federal debt in this country.
At the U.S. Capitol, speaking to reporters in the Ohio Clock Corridor, Senator John Thune, Republican of South Dakota. The Democrats want to pass President Biden's nearly $2 trillion climate and social spending package before Christmas. Alex Bolton, senior staff writer for TheHill.com, is on the phone to explain the biggest obstacle for Democrats. Alex Bolton, Democratic senators say West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin is their biggest obstacle to getting the legislation passed before the expanded child tax credit expires, and that's going to be at the end of the month. So is this a fair assessment of the situation?
I think it is a fair assessment. He is the biggest obstacle to getting the bill wrapped up. And there are other obstacles as well, but none of them are seen as serious as Manchin's refusal to commit to vote for the bill. Other things that need to be done, it needs to be vetted by the parliamentarian to make sure that it's eligible under the Senate's special budget reconciliation rules that will allow Democrats to circumvent a filibuster. That work is still going on, and there are a couple of outstanding disagreements still amongst the Democrats, in particular over a proposal to raise the cap on state and local tax deductions. But all that stuff is seen as solvable and as doable before the Christmas break. But Manchin remains stubbornly non-committed to this bill. And I just asked Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer about whether he could, in fact, guarantee a vote on Build Back Better before Christmas. And he said that he pointed the talks between President Biden and Joe Manchin and said he's going to wait for those talks. So I think it's pretty clear from that Manchin is the final and biggest obstacle, and that the person who's going to be responsible for getting Manchin on board is going to be Joe Biden, who's right now negotiating with the West Virginia Democrat.
And the Republicans and some centrist Democrats, though, are going along with Senator Joe Manchin, saying the package is too expensive. Reading between the lines, what does the average American need to know about what the major drivers of the U.S.'s current debt load is, at least according to Republicans and Democrats in Congress?
Well, I mean, the debt, as Joe Manchin pointed out to reporters recently, is getting close to $30 trillion, and it's a lot of money. But there are, many factors for the debt rising and the deficit being a persistent problem. Of course, Medicare is one of the biggest, drivers of the debt and the deficit. Yet, there is no talk on Capitol Hill about curtailing those benefits. Instead, there's talk about expanding Medicare benefits, and that's one of the things that's a sticking point between Manchin and Democrats like Bernie Sanders. But Democrats say that the Build Back Better bill is largely paid for, and they're arguing that it will not have a substantial impact on the debt. They're pointing to the Congressional Budget Office score that says that it will add slightly more to the debt over 10 years compared to the bipartisan infrastructure bill that had a bunch of Republican support and which Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell voted for earlier this year. The Republicans said that the amount added to the deficit and debt by that bipartisan infrastructure package was negligible. Well, the amount added by the Build Back Better bill isn't much more. Now, what the Republicans argue, though, is that the reason the Build Back Better bill costs only, an estimated $1.7 trillion to $2 trillion is because many of the programs are designed to sunset early in the 10-year budget window. They say that's not realistic. They said that there's going to be a lot of pressure on Congress to extend those programs, and once they do, the real cost of the bill isn't going to be $2 trillion, it's going to be closer to $5 trillion. But Senate Majority Leader Charles Schumer was just asked about this and said that that is a, quote, fake argument. What the Democrats say is that if these programs are in fact extended, they will come up with additional pay-fors, and they'll look at other ways maybe to raise corporate taxes or to raise taxes on billionaires. So they say that you can't judge this bill based on what may happen in the future. You have to judge it on the merits as it's drafted. Right now, Joe Manchin called the special Congressional Budget Office score requested by Republicans, showing that this could cost as much as $5 trillion if all the programs were extended in a future Congress. He called that very sobering, but he hasn't used it to call for a pause or to stop this bill entirely. So he seems to be weighing his options, and it's very frustrating for Democrats who want to get an answer one way or the other from Manchin, and meanwhile Republicans are rooting Manchin on and saying he's the only guy who can stop this dead in its tracks, and they're essentially pleading with him to do just that. And
if this fails, what are political strategists saying that should happen next?
Well, that's a very good question. There's a debate right now as to whether Democrats should bring this Build Back Better bill to the floor next week and have a vote and kind of force Manchin to make a decision one way or the other. But there's a real risk there that if he does vote against it and this bill goes down, then what? What's the next step? And no one really has a very clear idea about that. The worry is that if this bill is defeated on the Senate floor, it's going to be tough to revive it. So I think right now Democrats are not going to bring this to the floor until they know Manchin is going to vote for it. So that means I think a vote is likely to happen after Christmas, but that hasn't been announced officially yet.
Alex Bolton, senior staff writer at thehill.com. Thank you so much for joining us. President Biden's nominee to become FDA Commissioner, Dr. Robert Califf, testified at his confirmation hearing before the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. Senator Bernie Sanders, independent of Vermont, questioned Dr. Califf on special interest groups in the pharmaceutical industry.
You own millions of dollars in stock. You've been a consultant to the industry. How can the American people feel comfortable you're going to stand up to this powerful special interest?
Senator Sanders, I have a history of doing that, but I'd also point out this administration has the most stringent ethics pledge in the history of administrations. They've reviewed my status. I've agreed to the ethics pledge. And FDA and HHS have excellent staff whose job it is to make sure that those ethics pledge.
Okay, thank you. Let me ask you another. I apologize. This is not a lot of time. According to the FDA's website, its mission is to, quote, make medical products more effective, safer, and more affordable. End of quote. If confirmed, what would you do to make the outrageously high cost of prescription drugs in this country more affordable? Do you believe, for example, that when the federal government pours millions and millions of dollars into the development of a drug, we should have a reasonable pricing clause which prevents the drug companies for charging consumers what they have already paid to develop? Do you believe in reasonable pricing?
I certainly believe in reasonable pricing, and four specific things I'll just quickly mention just to rail them off. Number one, we need to develop even more robust generics. 90% of prescriptions are generic. The biosimilars program needs to continue to develop. That's an area where
So
prices
do you believe,
are lower.
again, I apologize, there's not a lot of time. When the federal government puts money into the development of a drug, should consumers be protected from high prices? Yes,
I think
no?
in any situation, consumers should be protected from high
Should
prices.
Medicare
cause
be able to
financial toxicity.
negotiate prescription drug prices?
Yes, and I'm on record. There was a policy of the previous administration.
You think
on record in
Medicare
writing.
should do what the Veterans Administration does?
Well, I can't say exactly what the Veterans Administration
VA
does, but
pays
yes.
half the price that Medicare pays for its drugs. Should Medicare do what the VA does?
I'm on record of being in favor of Medicare negotiating with the industry on prices.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Robert Califf, President Biden's nominee to become FDA commissioner, responding to questioning from Senator Bernie Sanders as he testified during his confirmation hearing before the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. 1 year ago today, New York nurse Sandra Lindsay became the first person in the U.S. to get the COVID-19 shot. The New York Times reporting that since then she has received an award for her contributions to the country from President Biden and a flood of messages from people nationwide praising her for her courage. Ms. Lindsay said she had no idea that when she got the shot, she would be making history. She simply wanted to get vaccinated early to alleviate her own fears around the virus and to set an example for those in her community. Read more on her story at nytimes.com. And now, as the U.S. is on the verge of yet another pandemic milestone, that's 800,000 deaths, Pfizer updated results on its experimental pill to treat COVID-19. Here's Pfizer CEO Albert Bourla speaking on CNN earlier.
How does this change, in your view, the course of this pandemic?
I think it's a game changer because right now one of the biggest problems that we are facing it is that when we have peaks of this disease, when we have the waves that are coming, the hospitals are really crowded, and that creates significant issues to the healthcare system. Right, with this pill, we are expecting that instead of 10 people going to hospital, only one will go, and actually no one is dying. So these are very, very good news.
And if people see this news and think, I don't need to get vaccinated or boosted anymore, I can just take this pill, what do you say to that?
I'm afraid that there will be some people that will think like that. It's a very big mistake. Vaccines are needed. Vaccines is the primary frontier that we should be using to stop the disease. The goal is not to get sick and then hopefully have a medicine that can save you. The goal is not to get sick. And not only you not to get sick, but to prevent sickness from your kids, prevent that you get sick and then you transfer that to your mothers, to your fathers, to your parents. It's very important that people will take the vaccines. And for those that are unfortunate, that despite that, or because they didn't take the vaccines, they are sick, of course now we have something that will save a lot of lives.
Pfizer CEO Albert Bourla speaking on CNN. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention reporting that more than 200 million people have been fully vaccinated here in the United States. That's roughly 60% of the population. Washington Today continues in a moment.
C-SPAN offers a variety of podcasts that have something for every listener. Weekdays, Washington Today gives you the latest from the nation's capital. And every week, Book Notes Plus has in-depth interviews with writers about their latest works, while The Weekly uses audio from our immense archive to look at how issues of the day developed over years. And our occasional series, Talking With, features extensive conversations with historians about their lives and work. Many of our television programs are also available as podcasts. You can find them all on the C-SPAN Now mobile app or wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to Washington Today. The House took up legislation to monitor and combat Islamophobia globally. This is an issue that Democrats have argued demands immediate attention from the U.S. government. Representatives Ilhan Omar, Democrat of Minnesota, and Jan Schakowsky, Democrat of Illinois, introduced the legislation known as the Combating International Islamophobia Act back in October. The measure calls for the State Department to establish an office headed by a special envoy to be appointed by the president. The office would record instances of Islamophobia, including violence against and harassment of Muslims and vandalism of their mosques, schools, and cemeteries worldwide, in reports created by the State Department. The Air Force discharged 27 people for refusing to get the COVID-19 vaccine, making them what officials believe are the first service members to be removed for disobeying the mandate to get the shots. The Air Force gave its forces until November 2nd to get the vaccine, and thousands have either refused or sought an exemption. Air Force spokeswoman Ann Stefanik said Monday that these are the first airmen to be administratively discharged for reasons involving the vaccine. A child in Mississippi has died of influenza, marking the first pediatric flu death of the season. This news from the Mississippi Health Department officials. The Department of Health did not release the age of the child who died or where in the state the death occurred. And New York's Ethics Commission ordered former Governor Andrew Cuomo to give up millions of dollars. A publisher paid him to write a book about his response to the coronavirus pandemic. An attorney for former Governor Cuomo immediately called the action unconstitutional and promised a fight. The former governor was directed to turn over proceeds earned from American Crisis Leadership Lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic within 30 days under a resolution approved 12-1 by the Joint Commission on Public Ethics. This is according to multiple media reports. The order came a month after the commission voted to rescind the ethics approval it had given former Governor Cuomo before he entered into the $5.1 million book deal. Earlier, the House debated holding former White House Chief of Staff for President Trump, Mark Meadows, in contempt of Congress for refusing to cooperate with the January 6th Select Committee's investigation of the attack on the U.S. Capitol. Mark Meadows spoke about the charge on Newsmax Monday night.
Obviously, it's not a surprising decision by the committee. We really need to look at what it's all about. They have nothing to run on. They want to talk about Build Back Busted, and yet what they've done is had a contempt vote. We've tried very hard in a very transparent and accommodating way to share non-privileged information.
Right.
And what we found out tonight is that not only did that just get disregarded, but then they tried to weaponize text message, selectively leak them to put out a narrative that, quite frankly, that the president didn't act. And I can tell you, the president did act. This is all about, it's not about holding me in contempt. It's about coming after President Donald Trump. And sadly, that's what tonight's vote was all about.
Is there, are you still cooperating? I mean, you initially said you would cooperate. Is there any regret? Is there any decision there by you?
Well, we tried to help and accommodate the attorneys I had working with me, worked on non-privileged information. We said all along we were going to protect the president's executive privilege. We continue to do so. We will continue to do that. We think that it's a decision that the courts need to weigh in on. Obviously, Congress thinks that I should waive the executive privilege. It's not mine to waive. And so we're going to honor President Trump's executive privilege claim until the courts tell us different.
Former White House Chief of Staff for President Trump, Mark Meadows, speaking on Newsmax. Meanwhile, during a hearing with Select Committee investigating the January 6th insurrection, the chair of the House Rules Committee, Representative Jim McGovern, Democrat of Massachusetts, spoke about the evidence against Mark Meadows.
The texts sent to Mark Meadows that were released by the Select Committee last night were nothing short of a bombshell. The top personalities on Fox News who are today trying to cover up the gravity of what happened on January 6th knew who to go to stop the insurrection that day. The president's son knew who to go to. When Don Jr. texted that, quote, "It has gone too far and gotten out of hand," end quote, what was it that he was referring to? The it was the attempt to overthrow the election. The it was the attempted coup in the United States of America. Yet the president did nothing in those critical moments, in what the vice chair has rightly called his supreme dereliction of duty. So based on what we've already seen, I shudder to think what else Mr. Meadows is trying to hide.
Representative Jim McGovern of Massachusetts. Also speaking during a hearing with the Select Committee investigating the January 6th insurrection, Representative Liz Cheney, Republican of Wyoming.
Mr. Meadows received numerous text messages that he has produced without any privilege claim urging President Trump to take action. I read a number of those last night to the nation. Here are a few others from Republican members. quote, "It is really bad up here on the Hill." Another one, "The president needs to stop this ASAP." Another one, "Fix this now." And as we saw last night, dozens of texts, including from Trump administration officials, from members of the press, from Donald Trump Jr., urged immediate action by the president. But we know hours passed with no action by the president to defend the Congress of the United States from an assault while we were trying to count electoral votes.
Representative Liz Cheney continued offering more evidence as a basis to move forward with contempt charges against Mark Meadows.
Mr. Meadows has also got knowledge regarding President Trump's efforts to persuade state officials to alter their official election results. In Georgia, Mr. Meadows participated in a phone call between President Trump and Georgia Secretary of State Raffensperger. He was on the phone when President Trump asked the Secretary of State to, quote, "find 11,780 votes to change the result of the election in Georgia." At the time of the call, Mr. Meadows, according to texts he has turned over, appears to have been texting at least one other participant on the call. Again, Mr. Meadows has no conceivable privilege basis to refuse to testify on that topic, and doing so puts him in contempt of Congress. Finally, in the weeks before January 6th, we know that President Trump's appointees at the Justice Department told him repeatedly that his claims of election fraud were not supported by the evidence. They told him the election was not, in fact, stolen. President Trump intended to appoint Jeffrey Clark as Attorney General, in part so that Mr. Clark could alter the Department of Justice's conclusions regarding the election. Mr. Clark has now informed the committee that he anticipates potential criminal prosecution related to these matters, and he intends in upcoming testimony to invoke his Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination. As Mr. Meadows' non-privileged texts reveal, he was communicating multiple times with a member of Congress, a currently serving colleague of ours, who was working with Mr. Clark. Mr. Meadows has no basis to refuse to testify regarding those communications. He is in contempt.
Wyoming Republican Representative Liz Cheney. You're listening to Washington Today. Here on the phone with us, senior legal affairs reporter for Politico, Josh Gerstein, briefing us on the contempt of Congress charge against Mark Meadows. First question, what's unique about the case against former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows compared to others who have faced this January 6th Selects Committee?
Well, I mean, Meadows was really a focal point for people trying to contact President Trump or the White House on January 6th. We now know that there's evidence of text messages and other communications being funneled to Meadows of people inside and outside the administration, private individuals, even members of Trump's own family, trying to get him to take more aggressive action to disperse the demonstrators and rioters that had descended on the city on January 6th. And so I think, in a way, Meadows is the most significant witness we've seen so far because he seems like the person who, I don't know if he was relaying all this information to Trump, but he was really the fulcrum of these efforts to try to get a more aggressive response.
And speaking of which, some House Republicans are claiming that the January 6th Select Committee won't actually accomplish what it wants with these text messages.
Well, yes. I mean, they've already said that they believe, the Republicans have said that they believe that this effort that is based somewhat on the text messages to have Meadows held in contempt for not being willing to testify about them is going to be counterproductive. I mean, one of the problems is when you decide to go the route of contempt and of criminal contempt, which means trying to refer the issue to prosecutors to bring a case, as they've done for former Trump advisor Steve Bannon, you pretty much are closing the door on getting testimony from that person. The idea is to punish them for not cooperating rather than to try to coerce them or encourage them to cooperate. So, perhaps some deal will be cut before a vote or after a vote or before any charges are brought. But if that doesn't happen, you kind of sort of locking both sides into a confrontational position, which may not be consistent with actually getting more information from the witness here, Mr. Meadows.
Speaking of getting more information, we heard from members of this January 6th Select Committee referring to former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows' new book and how that has a lot of information. What role does this book play in this contempt charge?
Well, I mean, it plays a couple different roles. One is essentially the Democrats are arguing, look, you were able to go and do all these interviews about your book, and now you're saying you can't come and testify before a House committee. And you're insisting that these communications with Trump are sacrosanct and subject to executive privilege. But sometimes it seems like the privilege only applies with respect to Congress, and that Meadows is talking to everyone else about these things. So they're claiming there's an inconsistency there. The other part that plays into this is, there are things in Meadows' book that former President Trump is not happy with. Meadows laid out a chronology about how Trump came to be infected with COVID last year, suggesting that Trump ignored an initial positive COVID test that he got and possibly may have infected a lot of other people as a result. The former president, was clearly not happy with that, and so some people believe that Meadows' decision to cease his cooperation with the House investigators is a product of this back and forth dynamic that the book has caused in an effort to, try to gain favor with Trump.
And what should the average American know about this contempt charge with the January 6th Select Committee and what's happening now? Does it make a difference to the average American, according to legal experts, according to political strategists?
I think it does matter in the sense that are we going to get the full history of what happened on January 6th? Just the text messages we've seen come out in the last 24 hours indicate that there are significant parts of this story that we have not heard. That may be hard for the average person to imagine, given the number of words that have been spilled on January 6th over the last 11 months or so. However, it's now clear that there are parts of the story we don't know, and the House committee may be one of the few vehicles to get to the bottom of that, unless we see a sort of more aggressive approach from the Justice Department to investigating people close to Trump. And so far, we haven't seen any indication of that publicly. So I think the contempt proceeding is important in terms of getting to the bottom of that. That said, as I said earlier, if both sides are locked into a showdown over this, I do have my doubts about whether it's going to result in the committee getting useful information on the kind of timeline that they're looking to get it in the next month or two, where it could be useful in terms of their report. If this drags out for a year in another criminal contempt prosecution, it isn't going to be very helpful to that bottom line.
Briefing us on the contempt of Congress charge against Mark Meadows, senior legal affairs reporter for Politico, Josh Gerstein. Find his update at Politico.com. Josh Gerstein, thank you so much for joining us.
Happy to do it anytime.
Meanwhile, Washington, D.C. Attorney General Karl Racine on Tuesday filed a federal lawsuit against far-right groups Proud Boys and Oath Keepers over their role in the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. Attorney General Racine made the announcement outside the U.S. Capitol.
It is for these reasons that the independent Office of Attorney General for the District of Columbia is filing the first civil lawsuit by a state or municipal government to hold accountable the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, and more than 30 of their leaders and members for conspiring to terrorize the District of Columbia, for unlawfully interfering with our country's peaceful transition of power, and for assaulting our men and women in blue who valiantly defended the Capitol, the district, and our freedoms. Specifically, we're bringing this lawsuit pursuant to local and federal laws, including the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, a Reconstruction-era federal law designed to protect our country against violent conspiracies, protect our citizens against violent conspiracies, like the attack that took place on January 6. In the complaint, which has been filed and is public, we specifically allege that these vigilantes, insurrectionists, and masters of a lawless mob conspired against the District of Columbia, its law enforcement officers and residents by planning, promoting, and participating in the violent attack on the United States Capitol. We further allege the named defendants caused substantial and provable damage to the District of Columbia, and in particular to our courageous law enforcement officers who risked their lives, and some even died, to defend the Capitol, the District, and our country's freedoms. As the Independent Attorney General, I have the responsibility to enforce our laws and hold these violent defendants accountable because they cause actual physical and financial harm to our city, its employees, and our residents.
The 84-page civil complaint also lists dozens of individuals and seeks unspecified amounts of money damages from the defendants for what Racine described as, quote, restitution and recompense for the injuries inflicted in the attack. And now a reminder that all of our coverage is online anytime at cspan.org. And if you missed any of this program, you can find it at cspan.org/podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you'd like more on the stories that are shaping Washington delivered daily right to your inbox, you can subscribe to C-SPAN's evening newsletter, word for word. Just go to cspan.org/connect to subscribe. I'm Nkoyo Iyamba. Thanks for listening today to Washington Today.
C-SPAN's Washington Journal. Every day we're taking your calls, live, on the air, on the news of the day. And we'll discuss policy issues that impact you. Coming up Wednesday morning, George Mason University's Jamil Jaffer discusses the future of Guantanamo Bay detainees. Then Deputy Washington Bureau Chief of Insider, Dave Leventhal, talks about his report on members of Congress and financial conflicts of interest. Watch Washington Journal live at 7 Eastern Wednesday morning on C-SPAN or on C-SPAN Now, our new mobile app. Join the discussion with your phone calls, Facebook comments, text messages, and tweets.